Everybody, welcome to History 101. It's Jay one more time. And what we're going to be doing today is looking at some conceptual, that's history with a Y, conceptual ideas in history that will help you in any history course you take. American, world, European, it doesn't matter. These techniques can give you an advantage in learning about how and why things happen in the past. And remember how and why, because I'm going to say them a lot. So, the concepts I'm going to introduce you to are one called the time arrow, which is a way about thinking about how time works. The other is called hindsight, which is how we tend to think of the past, but it can lead to problems to do with analysis. And finally, a concept that historians don't really like, which is inevitability. Inevitable, things that are inevitable. And we'll talk about how and why that is. See what I did there? I said how and why again. All right. First, the time arrow. Time is linear. This is how we experience it in day-to-day life. We might want to use an example here of reading a book. So here we are, enjoying our favorite novel, Professor History versus Dr. Test, and as we're reading this adventure, and the chapters fly by, Professor History is taking action, results happen, there are consequences, he's surprised by man-eating sharks, whatever the case may be, until we get to the end and we found out that it's not Dr. Test who stole the time machine, it's Chips, his sidekick. Oh, Chips, he'll never win. So we get to the end of the story and we have this great reveal. While we're reading it, right, we don't know what's going to happen next. That's why we keep reading. We want to have the adventure of the story unfolding as if the actions that he has taken are dramatic and interesting, and we're keen to see what happens next. But when we finish a book, this is us right at the end, and we start looking back, we start saying that, oh, wait, of course it was Chips. All the clues seem to point in that direction. How silly of me to think otherwise. And we tend to forget that when we started the book, we were just filled with the mystery of what was going to happen next. Okay? So, what does this have to do with history? Well, I'll tell you. Here's another line, and we'll call this the time arrow, right? Because time is linear. We'll use a line to distinguish it. So, when we're studying history, we're already at this place of hindsight, right? That's what looking into the past, knowing what happened means. We knew, like when we finish a novel, when we're starting history and we finish a chapter, hindsight colors our judgment. We know that, say, in 1939, World War II breaks out. That's a fact. We read it in a chapter. But the important questions in history are answered with use two questions primarily: how and why. I think these are the most important. They're all important, but these ones are critical because they speak to human meaning and human agency, which are critical in history too. So, when we use hindsight, if you remember the novel that we just read, we can start thinking, well, of course, all the clues from, say, 1919 or 1918 to 1938, well, everything's marching along. I guess World War II might be, if you look at the clues there, inevitable. And this becomes a problem, right? Hindsight can make us feel so sure because we know what happens. We know there's so much evidence. It is incontrovertible that World War II starts in 1939. But it can make it seem inevitable because of hindsight. We know it's going to happen. To make sure we don't feel that things are inevitable, we should start using questions like how and why an event takes place. This gets us away from the idea of inevitability. It challenges any of those kinds of certainties. Because if, say, we went back to 1938, and there's a famous peace conference that happens in Munich, right? And at this peace conference, a series of diplomats and world leaders met in Germany to decide the fate of Czechoslovakia, which the Germans had partially occupied. Now, for many of us, knowing that 1939 is the unleashing of Hitler's war in Poland and the start of World War II, we'll go, well, it was inevitable that they would fail at Munich because World War II happens. Munich will not stop Hitler from starting a war against essentially the planet, but starting mainly in Europe. So that inevitability starts to color our judgment. And Munich is a highly controversial issue, if we start here and we remember where we were when we read our novel and we didn't know what was going to happen next, in other words, we try and understand the past as if the certainties of 1939 are not there, because most people in 1938 were not only glad that Munich happened, they believed it was going to work. It would stop the aggressions that Hitler had done and keep war at bay. Especially the president or the prime minister of Great Britain, Neville Chamberlain, who famously said after Munich, the agreement he had established would have peace in our time. And many people believed it. They were wrong, but they believed it, and they tried to work it. Why is this important? If we think that 1939 was inevitable because it happened, we'll look at Munich and automatically dismiss what they were doing as a failure. And many historians still do, but they do it for more complex reasons. And some historians actually say 1938 was a small success, that Hitler really wanted to push the British around and take more of Czechoslovakia without a fight instead of just getting the Sudetenland, which is what he legally got in terms of international diplomacy. Nobody asked the Czechs, which is really sad, but that's for another class. But Munich was not designed to fail. Munich failed because of how and why, in this case, Hitler's Germany ignored what happened here and marched towards war. So, to summarize, when we look at the past, hindsight can make things seem inevitable because we know they happened. But if we start asking questions from the perspective of, the people who did not know the consequences of their actions, people like world leaders do not think that what they do is inevitably going to work or not work. They're like us. They're trying new things. They're trying to make what they want happen, but they're in conflict with, of course, other people, other circumstances. So history is often about asking how and why events unfold. So when we look at the past, remember that even though we have the benefit of hindsight looking backwards, we should try to remember that, this is the time arrow, we should try to remember that just like our tomorrow, nothing is inevitable. The people who were doing stuff in the past were doing so without knowing that their actions were going to win, lose, succeed, or fail. And as long as we remember that, we have a better chance of understanding how and why they did what they did, as opposed to assuming that what they did was a foregone conclusion. Because there is nothing inevitable about history. We'll build more on this to do with the issue of context next time. Thanks again for listening. This is History 101, and we'll see you next time in the past.